the street. We've supported Mubarak, but at times we've tried to get him to ease his control and to allow popular participation. I refer you to the wiki leaks, which show that Washington has worked with dissidents as well as with activists at various times. Recognize finally, however, that whatever the US says, whatever position it takes, it will be accused of plotting to control events, of trying to get the regime that it wants. And there were two cheerleaders sitting on the sidelines, Ahmadinejad and Nasrallah, who will certainly lead that parade. Secondly, we have very limited ability to influence events. We cannot choose a leader. We are not the key driver. And finally, I would suggest that from the US perspective, the transformation of Egypt into a new political system wherein the Muslim Brotherhood is in the government is not a desirable outcome. And I can discuss this in more detail later on. If the Democrats emerge, if other political parties have been created and so on, that's a very, very different situation. However, as a last word, remember Iran. In Iran, after '79, the moderates and the secularists were running the government. It did not take Khomeini and his supporters long, however, to seize power. And we see today the results of that development. The key to Egypt's future, as far as the United States is concerned, is not to see that scenario replayed. Thank you.
I do think also it's a historic moment. What I would say is that the old order is in crisis. It's not clear how that crisis is going to play out. It's a great democratic upsurge which is taking place, started in a small country, in an unlikely place, Tunisia, but it's gone region-wide, really, and was not really anticipated from pretty much any source in terms of the major powers. Although they should have known, they had the intelligence and they had the economic and the political data available to have predicted that somewhere along the line things were going to break down. What I would call the temporal reasons for this crisis, and here I'm going to concentrate most of my remarks on Tunisia, are well known. And there are three. And again, Joe mentioned them. I put them in a slightly different way, but it's really the same. The first were economic issues. In the case of Tunisia, massive unemployment, but that's region-wide, particularly hitting university graduates, but beyond that. Secondly was the growing disparity between rich and poor, which is also region-wide. The second issue is corruption. In Tunisia's case, it was endemic. It concentrated in two ruling families, that of the ex-president Ben Ali and his wife, Lila Trabulsi. It's estimated, and this according to one of the WikiLeaks cables from a U.S. ambassador, that the two families either had their hands in or controlled 50% of the Tunisian economy. But corruption is an issue in Egypt and in the other places as well. So once again, we see a regional theme. And the third issue is political repression. And here, when you look at the statistics, it's rather startling. In the case of Tunisia, they had an internal police force of 180,000. The army was only 35 or 40,000. And the repression really began early in the 1990s, has only intensified in in the recent period. Once again, there's nothing unusual. We could see that pattern elsewhere. But I wanted to, and that you can read about in the news, and they're talking about these three themes pretty much everywhere, finally, although it's noticeable how little they talked about these themes before the crisis hit. I want to look at things on a little bit deeper level, though, because I think of these three themes as manifestations of deeper problems. And one of these problems I refer to as core peripheral relations, and it just needs to be explained briefly. By core peripheral relations, I'm talking about economic relations between a kind of more advanced economies of Europe on the one hand, and the peripheral role of the Middle East, African countries on the other. If you look at the Tunisian economy, for example, the main themes of this economy are tourism. They have some mining, phosphates, agricultural production, and textiles. These are all low-wage forms of activity. Very little advanced technical manufacturing or production that's going on in the country. And combine that with a highly educated population, because Tunisia did have and does have a pretty good educational system. So you have an education system that's producing not just literate people, but people with a higher education, good technical education on the one hand, and what's the job possibilities that they have on the other? The job possibilities are in low wage areas. For example, Tunisian tourism, they're proud that hotel stay in Tunisia is the cheapest in the Mediterranean. So that combination really just couldn't last. And in fact, that combination is common in a number of other places where you have highly educated populations and, if you like, these peripheral economies. The peripheral economy is still a holdover, believe it or not, from the colonial days. And what's interesting about that is it's been so persistent. If you look at the economic structures, they haven't changed much in 100 years. Yes, political independence has changed, but the economic ties haven't. And I mention that because one of the challenges, from what I could tell, to make these changes, to really give them roots so that they take, is to somehow transform that economic relationship. Because if the economic relationship changes, I believe that some really interesting things could happen. But if it doesn't, probably what will happen is we'll have a short kind of democratic upsurge, followed by, if not a Ben Ali, something like it. There seems to be a relationship between peripheral economies and authoritarian rule. So that's one problem that I think is really significant. And here, there's something that has been alluded to, and I've been looking at it in some detail, and it has to do with the economic model, and that has to do with the impact of World Bank and IMF structural adjustment programs. I don't want to go into the details of this. It would take too long to do that. But in some ways, what we see in Tunisia was considered a model, a successful model of World Bank and IMF structural adjustment programs. There are two of them that are often touted in Africa. One is Ghana and the other is Tunisia. Well, what did it mean? One was keeping wages low. All right. Secondly was cutting government expenses. All right. Well, that basically means cutting the state sector, cutting jobs in that area. But the other thing, in Tunisia's case, the really key thing was the privatization program. And here, what the logic has been, if you like, the theology almost of the logic, is that if you privatize state industries, that somehow the privatized industries will be more efficient, there'll be more investment that goes into it, and productivity will increase, et cetera, et cetera.